Nadia, you just got back from Sudan, and what's the situation like there now?
Situation now, at least with those general strikes, I think is largely unchanged to how it was when I was there. These are quite piecemeal, sporadic strikes. When I was there, we saw electricity workers go on strike. We saw bank workers go on strike. And that didn't seem to affect the capacity of the military to really, it didn't push them to get back around the negotiating table. And I suspect it'll be something similar this time around. Remember, these are only 2-day long strikes. It's not very long at all. And I think what we see, though, is that the message from the opposition and the protesters is largely unchanged here. They have a two-pronged strategy. One is these strikes to try and kind of grind the normal functioning of the country to a halt. These strikes we're seeing are impacting particularly buses and airports, to try and grind civil administration in the country to a halt, as well as depriving the state of really urgently needed tax revenue as well. And the other thing that they're trying to do that hasn't changed is to keep up physical pressure in the capital. Remember, this sit-in area that protesters control is huge. It's in the very centre of Khartoum, the capital city, and it's right outside the military headquarters. People sleep there. They're not going anywhere, and they don't want to give it up, because for them that is really a bit of very powerful leverage, because it stops traffic moving around the capital city. But the other thing to note when we're looking at the strategy of the opposition at these strikes is that we sometimes think about the opposition as a kind of monolithic entity, but actually it's not. It's deeply factionalized within the protesters themselves. You've got Islamists on one hand, you've got communists all the way on the other, and then you've got the formal political opposition parties as well. And I'd note Sadiq al-Mahdi, who's one of the historic opposition leaders in Sudan, who opposed the old regime for decades. He's against these strikes. He says, actually, these aren't working for Sudan, and I don't want my followers to participate. So that may be as well why we're seeing that these strikes perhaps aren't having the kind of impact that the protesters so clearly want to see.
And Nadia, the leaders of the Military Council have been touring Gulf states. What's that about?
Yeah, these are the two men who are effectively leading Sudan at the moment in the run-up to this apparent transition, General Burhan and General Hamdan, known in Sudan as Hemeti. They've been visiting Egypt, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And while these images of what we're seeing in Sudan, these protests may have been capturing a lot of attention, this behind the scenes, I think, is really significant as well. These are regional powers trying to shape the future of what Sudan will look like. Now, if you think in the past, perhaps if we'd seen a similar kind of Arab Spring-style revolution, which is really what this was in Sudan in the past, you might have seen countries like the United States being quite vocal as to what they wanted the country to look like. Here in Europe as well, clearly countries have been distracted, and it is Gulf states that are trying to influence the future now. We saw Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates pledge $3 billion towards Sudan's future. And when you're at the protest site, among the cries of, we want democracy now and we want a civilian administration as soon as possible, they also say, we don't want your money. Protesters are deeply distrustful of these kinds of talks with Gulf leaders. They think this is a way to try and cook up some kind of deal to keep the military in power longer than those 3 years. I'd note that General Burhan, who is the leader of the Military Council, his first trip was to Cairo to see Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, another military general who was installed there after an Arab Spring-style revolution. People very wary that Sudan might be looking at something similar if those talks with the opposition continue to remain as stalled as they are at the moment.